the most fascinating terrorist figure I think I've ever come across. We're familiar with bin Laden. Bin Laden and Zawahiri, and his number 2 guy, they were of a completely different type. These were people who were professionals. Bin Laden was an engineer. His number 2 was a medical physician, so they're educated, sophisticated people. They have sort of a strategic vision of this terrorist organization is trying to create. Zarqawi was none of that. He was just a street tough. That when he was in school, he cut other kids with razors. He got involved in drugs. He got a tattoo. He was just a street tough, but he had a lot of swagger and a lot of charisma. Think of just kind of like it's like a junior mafia guy who just thinks he's everything. And layered on top of that is this religious zeal, which makes him this really powerful combination of utter brutality and absolute religious zeal. Piousness, but in this really strange way that he kind of creates for himself. So he becomes this uniquely dangerous person. He's someone who can rally people around him, but the people he brings around him, though, are criminals or people who are like him, people who are from the lower classes who want to break things and make a commotion, but they're not very smart about it always. He sort of brings that energy together into something that's very different, and it becomes a terrorist movement that's much more violent, much more just about blowing up things for its own sake and not necessarily trying to achieve some great strategic objective, because they're at heart very, very violent people. It's just part of their personality. It was certainly part of Zarqawi's.
Did he grow up like when did he become very religious with it, under this veil of religion for his terrorism?
It's a really interesting story. So here's a guy I mentioned. He was a street thug, but he actually grew up in a middle class family. His father was like a civil servant, but he was the ne'er-do-well in the family. He's the guy who was always getting in trouble, always having to be gotten out of prison. And then his family had this intervention for him when he was a young man and tried to kind of force religion on him. They started to send him to mosque, and he went to prayer groups, and he started taking it somewhat seriously. But then right around the same time, it's when a lot of young Arab men were going off to Afghanistan because there was this big holy war going on there. And it seemed exciting and glamorous, and so Zarqawi signed up for that. And so as a young man in his early 20s, he heads off to Afghanistan to fight the Soviets. And he gets there too late. Soviets have already left. But then he tries to connect with bin Laden. And skipping ahead a little bit, bin Laden looks at this young guy from Jordan, this rough, crude, foul-talking, violent young man, and decides that he's too crazy for Al-Qaeda. So he gets rejected. He gets said, well, you can't be part of our group. You can start your own. You can go to this other place and do your own camp if you want to, but you're too nuts for us. And that actually becomes a schism that we'll see later between Al-Qaeda and ISIS, which hate each other now.
Well, that's the dark comedy here. You have Al-Qaeda, who we grew up, 9/11 and all that, and suddenly ISIS happens, and they're like, listen, yo, we're not that.
Yeah, we're not cutting people's heads off and just killing Shiites because they're Shiites. All these things that they thought were just way too inflammatory, too dangerous, and just too brutal.
Yeah.
But that was the Zarqawi way. The cutting people's heads off, that was Zarqawi. That's what he liked to do. And Al-Qaeda was horrified by it. So it is amazing how this schism developed, and it really was a reflection of one man's personality, a man who just loved to bust things. And interestingly, he becomes a cult figure and still is. I mean, who do young jihadists look at? Whose videos do they like to watch? Whose face do they like to have on posters and T-shirts? It's not bin Laden, who's this old, pious guy with a long beard and likes to give long sermons on videotape. Zarqawi is this man of action. He's the guy who kills Americans with his own hands. He looks like a ninja warrior with his do-rag and his sneakers and is a completely different kind of terrorist character.
He looked the part. I mean, those eyes, you look at that, it's just, it's scary, it's eerie.
And shooting machine gun from the hip. And the thing that made him famous to Americans was one day he picked up an American businessman off the streets of Baghdad and puts him in front of a camera, and Zarqawi beheads him with a knife.
Who was that?
So it's a young man who's and I'm going to blank on his name, so we'll have to check that out.
Nick Berg?
Nick Berg, I'm sorry. Thank you for remembering that. So Nick Berg was a guy from Philadelphia, actually. He was a young man who had this vision of being, one of the businessmen who was going to rebuild Iraq. So he moved himself there, tried to start a business, didn't get very far, but ended up in the wrong place at the wrong time, and Zarqawi's people picked him up and decided to make an example out of him. Put him in an orange jumpsuit, which everybody at the time was kind of associating with Gitmo and with Abu Ghraib and all the scandals about the Iraqi prison that were coming out at the time, and sort of did that deliberately to send a message to the Americans. And Zarqawi stands in front of him and says, this is what we're going to do to your people, and takes a knife out and essentially chops his head off.
Hey guys, please subscribe to the channel and check out this clip's full podcast episode by clicking here or in the description below.